business news from the Capital Region. This is Washington Business Report with ABC7 national correspondent Rebecca Cooper.
Thanks for joining us for a fresh look at business and finance in the Washington region. This week in our Small Business Spotlight, Virginia innovators and entrepreneurs pitching their products straight to the governor. And in the roundtable, a rough week for the markets and the costs of Ebola fear for the national economy and Washington businesses. We'll have that and more coming up later in the show. But first, this week we sit down with former Senator John Sununu, the son of famously pugnacious former New Hampshire governor and White House Chief of Staff John Sununu. But this Sununu says he got more of his political skills from his mother, who sat on the local school board and taught him the art of working with others while fighting for what you believe. Now he's using those skills in the business world, taking on what some have called one of the most important fights for our economy. New rules being developed by the FCC governing broadband and so-called net neutrality. It's going to impact all of us as regulators decide how to strike the balance between open competition and internet for all. First up in our one-on-one, the engineer turned senator turned business and broadband advocate says it's misleading to claim the new rules could create internet fast lanes for some and slow lanes for others. Senator Sununu, welcome to Washington Business Report. Why is it that everyone looks healthier after they've left Congress?
Oh, you know, that's nice of you to say. I've got a little less hair than when I was in the Senate. There's a certain sense that I think anyone gets when they start a new career or career path or part of their career. That's part of it. There's no question in the private sector, even if you're working full-time, working, quote, as hard as you ever have, the fact is that you control your own time to a much greater degree than you do in Congress. In Congress, other people at least try to control your time with a committee hearing or when they schedule votes. You don't have a say. Constituents that visit, you need to meet with them, but you can't tell them, don't come to Washington on Thursday, come on next Monday. They're there with an organization or a group or friends or family, and they want to see you.
So for people who haven't seen you since the Senate, catch us up. You talked about a new career path. You're doing a little bit of everything. How would you describe your career now?
So when I left the Senate, I was excited to get back into the world of technology. I'm a director at Time Warner Cable, a great broadband company, a director at Boston Scientific, really a leading inventor and developer of medical devices, stents, defibrillators, pacemakers, and in the world of neuromodulation as well, using stimulation to deal with chronic pain. So it's very exciting. I work with a small venture capital firm that's making investments in the pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, and have a few consulting clients on the technology side.
Tell us about leaving. What do you miss about the Senate, and what do you like about life after the Senate?
Yeah, that's a great question. The things I miss are perhaps first the policy work and the substantive work on the committees on which I served. So the Finance Committee, a Budget Committee, tax issues, financial service issues on the Banking Committee, and the Commerce Committee, where I did a lot of work on telecommunications, broadband policy, internet, spectrum allocation. I enjoyed that work in part because of my technical background, and that's one of the things I've been able to pick up again with my work at Time Warner Cable, but also in co-chairing Broadband for America, which is an organization focused on broadband policy, investment, access, adoption, and how to improve the broadband infrastructure across America.
So let's talk about that organization. You're the co-chair along with Harold Ford, a well-known Democrat who's no longer in office. What made you get involved in this issue, and tell us where you stand on this issue?
Harold and I were elected to Congress together in 1996, so we've been friends for a long time. And I was asked to be a co-chair of Broadband America for America with him. We do a lot of policy work on the impact of broadband investment on job creation, economic activity. It's amazing to look at the internet today because it changes so fast we forget. 1 million people are employed in the apps industry, which didn't exist 6 or 7 years ago. That's really amazing. Broadband and wireless invests more in infrastructure than any other sector of our economy. $45 billion in infrastructure last year alone, and that's really impressive. So on the regulatory side, though, one of the things we're focused on is making sure that we maintain a light touch regulatory approach that started under Bill Clinton, was maintained under Democrat and Republican presidents all the way up until the present day. The FCC is working on new net neutrality rules because the old ones were thrown out by the court at the beginning of this year. And I think it's important that they're consistent with the framework we've had for 20 years, which is to say a modest, light-touch regulatory approach that encourages investment, competition, and innovation.
But it was one of the big companies that brought the challenge against the rules that caused the FCC to throw out the current rules. They're in the midst of trying to revise the rules. The public comment period is over. One of the most contentious public comment periods in the history of the FCC. They got more comments than any other issue. You've taken a very definite view on this issue. Sure. Where do you come down?
Well, I think, look, the question at hand is whether you maintain that light touch regulatory approach I just talked about, or try to adopt something much more draconian, much more different than what we had before. And what some are proposing is called Title II regulation, which is the way we used to regulate Ma Bell monopoly copper telephone system. And that is not the approach we should be taking for a 21st century internet.
But you hear the other side of it. Critics say it's exactly the approach we need when you've got such big, powerful companies.
Well, first of all, they're not monopolies. I mean, you know, most everyone has a choice of at least 2, if not 3 different broadband providers. The number of providers is increasing. More importantly, speeds are increasing. The average speed of broadband connections increased 25% in just the last year. We really lead the world now in access to high-speed networks, next-generation networks, both wireless and fixed line, you know, broadband and cable connections. And it's important to remember that Title II, when the FCC talked about it earlier this year, the last time they were making rules, you saw the market values of all kinds of broadband companies contract because Title II is much more restrictive in overseeing the way companies can invest, the way they can price their products, the way they can package their products. It does not encourage the kind of infrastructure investment I just talked about. It discourages it. And there's no evidence that we need it, given how well that light touch regulatory approach that Bill Clinton started and George Bush and even Barack Obama continued in his first term, that has worked well.
Explain to anyone in the business world what net neutrality, what the stakes are for net neutrality.
We want to make sure that consumers are never blocked from getting access to lawful internet content. Second, you want to make sure that if broadband providers are managing traffic, that there's transparency and disclosure as to how they're doing that to make sure that it's fair. And then finally is discrimination. Make sure that any internet provider isn't discriminating against the content that's going over their networks.
But what some consumer advocates, as you all know, have said is, we don't want there to be these so-called fast lanes where big companies like Netflix can have a faster way to provide data that will discriminate against.
So several advocacy groups have come up with this really boogeyman approach where they say, well, what if this happened? What if they created a slow lane and stuck certain consumers with the slow lane and a fast lane and gave it to only certain people? That wouldn't be a good thing, but the fact is, no one's proposing that. And remember, we didn't have net neutrality rules for 20 years of any kind. We don't have them today. And still, no internet provider is doing all these terrible things that some of the advocacy groups claim are happening or would happen.
And you have access to it, then people with more money will have access to a faster way to stream more data.
There's no question different companies offer different speeds. So the speeds are there and the speeds will continue to increase. But the idea that any provider would intentionally limit or throttle or block content or create a fast lane and a slow lane and demand money from content providers, there's no business case for that today. There's no internet provider that's trying to do that. Because
it would make business sense.
That's a great question. No, it wouldn't. And the reason it doesn't and probably won't in the foreseeable future is because that's not what consumers want. Right? This is driven by consumer preference, consumer sentiment. And I'm a consumer of the broadband and internet. I want the best, highest speed, most reliable connection I can get.
John Sununu, thanks for joining us on Washington Business Report.
Great to be with you.
When we come back, our small business spotlight. It's Techtober in Virginia, and that means some high-level exposure for local startups. That's next on Washington Business Report.